America's Keswick. I was with Mark at Harvey Cedars a number of years ago. And we went up for lunch to America's Keswick, and the men that served the lunch were part of the drug rehab program. And afterwards, they sang as a choir, 60 of them, and they sang "Victory in Jesus." Whenever I hear that song, those memories come back, and it's such a precious memory to think of those men singing that wonderful song, "Victory in Jesus." And I've really enjoyed tuning in and listening to Warren and Bruce and the reports from Paul and Chris and Leighton. We live about an hour and a half from Leighton, and our assembly donates lots of material to that street ministry. And we're certainly going to miss Leighton from this area. Well, as we go back to the book of Habakkuk, just a quick review. We saw in chapter 1, he was in the midst of the problem. He's worrying about what's going on, wondering why God doesn't respond, and then when God responds, the worry and the wonder actually increase. He's on the ground in the midst of the problem. In chapter 2, he removes himself from that situation, and he's now up on a rampart, physically distances himself, different perspective, but he's watching and waiting for what God would have to say. He has no answer for what he's heard in chapter 1, so he wants to hear from God. When we get to chapter 3, we will find him worshiping and then witnessing as he just relies by faith. The just shall live by faith. He's heard God speak to him, now he's going to respond to that. I was thinking of what God does here, God's response. I was thinking of the words of a New England poet, James Lowell from Massachusetts, wrote these words: "Careless seems the great avenger, history's pages but record. One death grapple in the darkness between the truth, darkness twixt old system and the word. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own." And we can be so thankful for that. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. The progression that Habakkuk expresses in his personal experience is one that I'm sure many of us have experienced and should continue to experience. Just the movement from being on the ground, looking around, on the rampart, looking down, on our knees, looking up, and then the little book ends with him on the heights, looking down, not sighing anymore, but singing with joy in his heart. And so I trust that would be true of us as well, as we think of this progression here in the book of Habakkuk. And so when we come to chapter 3, he starts with this as a prayer. And what Habakkuk does in his prayer, and it reminds me of what Bruce just spoke on from the book of Daniel, is he really goes to the Word of God. If you had time to look at the phrases that he uses here in chapter 3 and then go back to the Psalms, you would see that he's drawing from the Word of God. He's just quoting and applying passages from the Psalms. In particular, if you were to look at Psalm 77, Psalm 18, Psalm 68, and a number of other Psalms, various verses from other Psalms, this is what he draws from here as he stands in the presence of God, or kneels in the presence of God and worships the Lord, going to the Word of God for his strength and solace. And so in verse 2, he says, "O Lord, I've heard your speech and was afraid." Now the NIV says, "I stand in awe of your wonders, O Lord." Perhaps a better thought. He's gone from fear in chapter 1, and now he's in awe of what the Lord is doing. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of your years. In the midst of your years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. And really, his focus now is not just on himself, but on the nation. His focus is on others. It's true that he speaks of himself through this, but here in this prayer, at the start of it, he's asking for God to do something in the midst of God's people. And knowing that judgment's coming, his appeal is that God would show mercy. And of course, the thought is that he's concerned for others. Now in verses 3 down to 16, we won't read all of these verses. This is where he's looking back into Old Testament scriptures. He would have the book of Psalms, perhaps not all completed by this time, certainly not because the 105th Psalm had been added a long time after Habakkuk's life. But he looks through the Psalms and he draws on them. He talks in verse 3 down to verse 7 about the person of God, the appearances of God, the greatness and majesty of God. And then verse 8 down to verse 15, he's talking about God's action. So from his appearance to actions, from his person to his power, what he accomplished. And it's a great lesson for us to focus on the Lord. And we've been reminded of that all through these sections, that's where our strength comes. That's where our help comes from. And joy is found in focusing on the Lord, not focusing on circumstances. Here, Habakkuk's rising above. We'll see that through this chapter. But he starts to rise above by spending time on his knees and talking to the Lord in this prayer. So in verse 3, he goes back to a former appearance of the Lord. And as you look at these verses, we will read from verse 3 to verse 7. You can picture in your mind Old Testament scenes where God revealed himself. Verse 3, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Selah, his glory covered the heavens, and the earth was filled with his praise. His brightness was like the light he had raised, flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations. And the everlasting mountains were scattered, the perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian tremble. And so his occupation here is with the person of God. Problems put aside, and now his focus is different. If you just keep your finger there to look over at Psalm 77 for a moment. Psalmist does a similar thing here, and it's perhaps one of the psalms that Habakkuk has in mind as he pens these words. Psalm 77 is a great psalm if somebody is discouraged or even depressed. It's a wonderful psalm to turn to, just as an outline. The first 9 verses, it's all about the individual. The personal pronouns occur about 20 times in the first 9 verses.